War has always tested the limits of human morality, pushing nations to make decisions that blur the line between security and savagery. History is filled with moments when fear and necessity clashed with the ideals of justice. From the trenches of World War I to the deserts of Iraq and the mountains of Afghanistan, the choices of military powers have repeatedly challenged the rules meant to protect human dignity in conflict. Among these rules, the Geneva Conventions stand as one of the most important milestones in international law, a universal agreement to place boundaries on the chaos of war.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hegseth, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Senator.
You've made several references to your religion today. I share that devotion to Christianity, but I must say I've been reminded somewhat of Saul on his way to Damascus. You seem to have been converted over the last several weeks and several months. You wrote in your book just last year that, but if we're going to, this is the book, War on Warriors, but if we're going to send our boys to fight, and it should be boys, we need to unleash them to win. Later on, our boys should not fight by rules written by dignified men. Which is it? Is it only boys can fight? I mean, you've testified here today that you believe in women in combat, but you didn't just last year. How do you explain your conversion?
Senator, my testimony is clear. Writing a book is different than being Secretary of Defense, and I look forward to leading the men and women of our military. And my comment there, Senator, was about the burdensome rules of engagement that members of our generation, men and women, have seen on the battlefield. And one thing President Trump changed in meaningful ways that led to meaningful developments on the battlefield. When President Trump took control in the first term, ISIS was raging across Iraq. And as someone who spent a lot of time there with other men and women who invested in that mission, it was a very difficult moment to see the black flag of ISIS fly. And what President Trump did was untie the hands of warfighters. He changed the rules of engagement, untied the hands of warfighters, and allowed them to complete their mission and crush ISIS. It has not just tactical implications, operational and strategic implications, how you allow warfighters to go about winning and fighting their wars. President Trump understands that, and within the laws of war and the Uniform Code of Military Justice, we are going to unleash warfighters to win wars so that wars don't drag on forever, as our generation has seen.
So are you rejecting Title 18 and Title 42, I think, also has provisions that incorporate the Geneva Convention and the laws of armed combat? Are you saying that those laws should be repealed? That is the law of the land right now.
Senator, we have laws on the books from the Geneva Conventions into the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and then underneath that you have layers in which standard or temporary rules of engagement are put into place. We fight enemies also, Senator, as our generation understands, that play by no rules. They use civilians as human shields.
So are you saying
they target
that
women and children?
The Geneva Convention should not be observed?
We follow rules. We follow rules, but we don't need burdensome rules of engagement that make it impossible for us to win these wars.
You're saying two different things. You're saying we follow rules, but we don't have to follow the rules in all cases. Is that correct?
Senator, I'm making Senator, I'm making an important tactical distinction that warfighters will understand. That there are the rules we swear an oath to defend, which are incredibly important, and this committee understands and helps set them. And then there are those echelons above reality, from, corps to division to brigade to battalion, and by the time it trickles down to a company or a platoon or a squad level, you have a rules of engagement that nobody recognizes. And then it makes you incredibly difficult to actually do your job on the battlefield. That's the kind of assessment and look that an Army major will give to this process if I was confirmed to be the Secretary of Defense.
Your quote is
true understanding of that.
Your quote in 2024, our boys should not fight by rules written by dignified men in mahogany rooms 80 years ago. That would be the Geneva Convention. America should fight by its own rules, and we should fight to win or not go in at all. Are you saying that the Geneva Convention provisions, which clearly outlaw torture of prisoners, should not apply in the future?
Senator, how we treat our wounded, how we treat our prisoners, the applications of the Geneva Conventions are incredibly important. But we would all have to acknowledge that the way we fought our wars back when the Geneva Conventions were written are a lot different than the asymmetric, non-conventional environment of counterinsurgency that I confronted in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was the senior counterinsurgency instructor in Afghanistan. My job was to understand how the Taliban and al-Qaeda operated so that NATO units coming in could be informed of what was happening. They knew our rules of engagement, and when they were more restrictive, they took advantage of them, and it put our men and women in a more dangerous and difficult place.
And you believe
For future wars we fight, we need to have someone atop the Pentagon, sir, who understands how those ripple effects
Well, I just want
impact
to
the men and women in
understand your
uniform.
position. Your position is torture's okay. Is that correct? Waterboarding, torture is no longer prohibited given the circumstances of whatever war we're in. Is that correct?
Senator, that is not what I said. I've never been party to torture. We are a country that fights by the rule of law, and our men and women always do. And yet we have too many people here in air-conditioned offices that like to point fingers at the guys in dark and dangerous places, the gals in helicopters in enemy territory who are doing things that people in Washington, D.C. would never dare to do, or send, in many cases.
In one of your interviews, you said they're willing to do this. You're talking about Donald Trump and Senator Cruz. They're willing to do something like waterboarding if it's going to keep us safe. Are you okay with waterboarding?
Senator, the law of the land is that waterboarding is not legal.
So the statement that you made, you now recant. Is that correct? They are willing to do something like waterboarding if it's going to keep us safe. You expressed that with approval.
Senator, I'm very familiar with that as a concept, having spent a year at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, guarding 700 of those that attacked us on 9/11.
I just want to be clear. Are we going to abide by the Geneva Convention and the prohibitions on torture, or are we not? Is it going to depend on the circumstances?
As I've stated multiple times, the Geneva Conventions are what we base ours. But what an American-first national security policy is not going to do is hand its prerogatives over to international bodies that make decisions about how our men and women make decisions on the battlefield. America First understands we send Americans for a clear mission and a clear objective. We equip them properly for that objective.
Right,
we give them everything they need, and then we stand behind them with the rules of engagement that allow them to fight decisively to defeat America's enemies, which is why we say
I just have a few seconds
peacefully
left, Mr. Hegseth, if you could. I was very disturbed in your opening statement where you talked about the priorities that you have. We will work with our partners and allies to deter aggression in the Indo-Pacific from the Communist Chinese. There's not a single mention in this statement about Ukraine or Russia. Is this code for we're going to abandon Ukraine?
Senator, the president, that's a presidential level policy decision. He's made it very clear that he would like to see a end to that conflict. We know who the aggressor is. We know who the good guy is. We'd like to see it as advantageous for the Ukrainians as possible, but that war needs to come to an end.
You talk a lot about deterrence of China. I would submit that Xi Jinping is watching what we do very carefully. If we abandon Ukraine, that would be the strongest signal possible to Xi Jinping that he can take Taiwan without significant resistance from this country.
Thank you, Senator King.
Yet these very rules often come under scrutiny when the stakes are highest. After the September 11th attacks, the United States faced unprecedented threats and responded with controversial measures, secret prisons, harsh interrogation tactics, and the detention of enemy combatants at Guantanamo Bay. These choices sparked a global debate. Do international laws like the Geneva Conventions hinder national security, or are they essential to preserving the values that distinguish democracy from tyranny? The tension between law and survival forces us to ask a profound question in protecting ourselves. How far are we willing to compromise the principles that define us? This dilemma lies at the heart of the Geneva Conventions in question, making their relevance and interpretation as critical today as ever. The Geneva Conventions, first established in 1864 and expanded after World War II, were designed to protect those who are not actively participating in hostilities, wounded soldiers, prisoners of war, and civilians. They represent a collective moral commitment by the international community to prevent the horrors of war from consuming basic human dignity. However, the post-9/11 world forced many nations, particularly the United States, to confront the question of whether these agreements can function in the face of modern terrorism. Unlike traditional wars, the war on terror had no clear battlefield, no uniformed enemy, and no formal declaration of war. Al-Qaeda and other non-state actors operated outside the boundaries envisioned by the original conventions, creating legal ambiguity. The U.S. government argued that members of terrorist organizations were unlawful combatants who did not qualify for the same protections as prisoners of war. This interpretation allowed practices such as indefinite detention and the use of enhanced interrogation techniques, which many international observers condemned as violations of the Geneva Conventions. Cases like Guantanamo Bay became symbols of the tension between national security and international law. Critics claimed that such actions undermined America's credibility and the very moral standards the Geneva Conventions aimed to uphold. Supporters, on the other hand, contended that the conventions were ill-equipped to handle asymmetrical warfare against shadowy, stateless enemies who themselves disregard all rules of war. This debate underscores a central issue: are the Geneva Conventions adaptable to modern conflicts, or are they relics of a different era? International law evolves slowly, while threats like terrorism evolve rapidly. The U.S. experience shows the difficulty of applying traditional legal frameworks to unconventional conflicts. While the conventions seek to protect human rights, they also assume that all parties will engage in some form of reciprocal respect for the rules. Non-state actors who use civilians as shields or refuse to wear identifying uniforms exploit this gap, leaving nations to choose between legal adherence and operational effectiveness. In questioning the Geneva Conventions, the world is really questioning how much it values the principles of human rights in the darkest of times. The controversy surrounding their application in the 21st century highlights not just the limits of international law, but also the moral struggles nations face when survival seems to demand compromise. The Geneva Conventions, long regarded as the backbone of international humanitarian law, were written to protect those who are most vulnerable in times of war. They outline the treatment of prisoners of war, the wounded and civilians, insisting on standards of human conduct regardless of political or military goals. However, modern warfare and the rise of non-state actors have exposed the limitations of these treaties. The post-9/11 war on terror created unprecedented legal and ethical challenges. Traditional wars involved clearly identifiable state armies, uniformed soldiers, and formal declarations of hostilities. In contrast, terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS operate without borders or uniforms, deliberately blurring the line between combatant and civilian. The United States faced a dilemma: could it hold terrorist suspects to the same protections offered to lawful combatants under the Geneva Conventions? The Bush administration's creation of the unlawful combatant category allowed for detentions at Guantanamo Bay, without granting traditional prisoner of war rights. This approach, justified as necessary for national security, ignited international outrage. Critics argued that it undermined the very foundation of the conventions, weakening their moral authority and inviting other nations to disregard them. Supporters maintained that the conventions were never designed to handle enemies who reject all rules of war and intentionally exploit humanitarian law for strategic gain. The controversies extend beyond detention to the treatment of suspects. Practices like extraordinary rendition and enhanced interrogation techniques sparked debates over whether the Geneva Conventions were violated. Officials often insisted that such measures were legal under domestic interpretations. International bodies, including the International Committee of the Red Cross, condemned these practices as breaches of humanitarian law. These incidents illustrate the tension between a state's desire to protect its citizens and the global expectation to uphold human rights. Moreover, the struggle with applying the Geneva Conventions in contemporary conflicts highlights a broader issue: the gap between international law and evolving forms of warfare. Hybrid conflicts, cyber attacks, and drone warfare further complicate the traditional rules. If the conventions cannot adapt, nations may increasingly sideline them in pursuit of security, risking a dangerous precedent where moral and legal constraints collapse. Ultimately, the body of this debate reflects a deep moral challenge. Can the world preserve the humanitarian ideals of the Geneva Conventions in an era when enemies refuse to follow any rules? Or must the law itself evolve, creating new frameworks to ensure both security and human dignity? The ongoing debates surrounding the Geneva Conventions ultimately highlight the fragile balance between security and morality in the modern world. These treaties were designed after the horrors of the world wars, to ensure that even in the darkest times, humanity would not be entirely lost. They represent a global consensus that war must have limits, protecting those who do not or no longer participate in hostilities. Yet the rise of non-state actors, asymmetrical warfare, and unconventional tactics has placed extraordinary pressure on this framework. The War on Terror, in particular, revealed how quickly nations might reinterpret or even sidestep these obligations when confronted with unprecedented threats. From Guantanamo Bay to drone strikes in foreign territories, the world has witnessed instances where the principles of the Geneva Conventions were tested, if not openly challenged. The creation of the unlawful combatant designation by the United States exemplified a legal gray area that many critics argue undermined the Convention's universality. This approach raised a critical question: can international law retain authority if powerful nations selectively apply its rules? If adherence to the Geneva Conventions becomes optional, their purpose is gravely weakened, opening the door for widespread abuses in future conflicts. However, this crisis also presents an opportunity. The current tension signals the urgent need to modernize international humanitarian law without abandoning its core moral principles. Updating the Geneva Conventions, or at least providing supplementary protocols, could address challenges posed by cyber warfare, terrorism, and transnational armed groups. Legal clarity is essential, not just to hold states accountable, but also to guide military personnel and policymakers when making life and death decisions. Furthermore, the survival of the Geneva Conventions depends not solely on legal mechanisms, but also on global political will. Upholding these humanitarian ideals requires that nations resist the temptation to erode them for short-term security gains. It demands collective recognition that the long-term legitimacy of international law is as vital to peace as any military operation. When states demonstrate consistent commitment to these standards, they reinforce a shared expectation that human dignity must prevail, even in war. In conclusion, the Geneva Conventions remain both a moral compass and a legal shield, but they are not self-enforcing. Their future hinges on the world's willingness to reconcile the realities of modern conflict with the timeless principles of humanity. Adapting the law, while preserving its core, is the only path to ensure that in the wars of tomorrow, the line between civilization and barbarity is not erased.